Next, we're going to have Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood. Anita Freit, Acting Assistant Secretary of State. And Steve Earhart.
With respect to cyber or other forms of attack, I think the context in which an attack occurred against the United States or allies would be very important. As we sit here today, it's easy to dissect one action being disconnected from that in other fields, other domains, whether that be in air, sea, on land, or whether you would contemplate a hypothetical situation that would involve employment of other forms of weapons of mass destruction, which were not nuclear weapons, such as biological weapons. And so I think what this NPR strives to do is to say, in the context of a non-nuclear attack on the United States or our allies that was strategic in nature, that imposed substantial impacts to our infrastructure, to our people, that we would consider that context in evaluating the appropriate response, perhaps to include nuclear weapons.
And the dollar amount of this program for DOD and also DOE, because that's very important. This is to, do the plutonium and modernize these facilities.
Right. We have a chart that shows some of the expenditure levels. Maybe we can bring that up here on the screen.
Go to the slides. I think it's going to be the third slide.
That's correct. And here you see the DoD nuclear enterprise funding that would occur over the period of the recapitalization of the U.S. nuclear triad. Nuclear triad, of course, consisting of ICBMs, or intercontinental range ballistic missiles on land, a sea-based nuclear deterrent with submarine-launched ballistic missiles, as well as an air leg for bombers armed with cruise missiles. And you see that here at the 2.7% of the DoD budget that we stand today, sustaining the current triad, the current infrastructure that we have in the DoD, would involve 2.7% of our budget. Now, as we project forward, and you'll notice this projection goes through the year 2040 on the chart, you see in the dark blue the recapitalization costs. And those will, under the current plans, the programs of record that the Defense Department has, grow to include an additional 3.7% of the DoD budget at its peak in 2029. Now, prior to that time, as shown on the chart, it's substantially less than that level, and in a noteworthy sense, after that peak, of course, it declines. And so that is the total amount for the Defense Department that we would see for a recapitalization of our enterprise funding. And then the chart helpfully provides some historical examples showing that percent is less than during previous recapitalizations that occurred in the 60s and 80s. I don't know if you want to speak to the DOE portion.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And before I do, I'd like to make the following statement. Given recent reporting on nuclear testing, I want to make it clear to you that all our testing posture, make it clear to all of you that our testing posture has not changed with this NPR. The United States remains committed to a moratorium on nuclear testing, and we encourage other states to adopt and maintain similar moratoria, just as you heard earlier. To the cost of infrastructure, so I'm pleased to be here representing the folks in NNSA, and I'm pleased that the NPR also points out as my Deputy Secretary said, the national imperative to improve, modernize our aging infrastructure, as well as continuing the work that we're doing on modernizing the stockpile itself. This has been mentioned in previous NPRs. But the resources available has not kept pace with the need to modernize to ensure that we always have the facilities that are necessary to maintain that safe, reliable, and effective stockpile. So I don't have the final number because we're working on the complete infrastructure plan, but I will tell you because of that delay and that lack of funding that's come over time, it will be significant, and it will need to be sustained investment over the next decade.
Idris Ali from Reuters.
Sure. On diplomacy, very quickly, this is clearly a Russia-centric NPR. How do you expect the Russians to respond and react? Have you briefed your counterparts on it? And secondly, your NATO allies are, some of them or many of them are less enthusiastic about nuclear weapons than the United States. How do you expect them to take this?
Well, first of all, I would not call this Russia-centric NPR. I mean, Russia is one of the countries we've mentioned, but we've mentioned China. We certainly mentioned DPRK. We mentioned Iran. Russia is not the sole focus of this NPR by any means. So that's one thing. We did, in fact, we briefed Russians on this, on the rollout of the NPR, and we remained. I mean, there seems to be sometimes the impression that we don't talk to the Russians. We talk to the Russians a lot. In fact, we are in the process of trying to work out another strategic stability discussion. So we have ongoing discussions. As I mentioned, we are successfully implementing the New START treaty, and we remain open to potential arms control, as we've briefed here, in the future. But what we need is the right security conditions, and we also need a willing partner, which has been lacking. But we certainly, and Russia is not an obstacle necessarily, or the point of this NPR. In terms of allies, we've had a very good discussion with allies here, consultations, I would say, throughout the process. And we began this in the 2010 NPR, where I was also involved. So that has been a very fruitful discussion with the allies. During the consultation, our allies uniformly commented on the worsened global security environment, and that is in comparison to the last NPR in 2010. There's no question that there's a worse security environment. So there is agreement on that. And we look forward to deepening our engagement with allies and partners. They did stress, now that's one thing, they are certainly interested in pointing out the importance of adherence to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the importance of pursuing arms control. As we pointed out in the NPR, that we certainly reiterate the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, our ongoing commitment to it, and our willingness to pursue, as I mentioned, arms control, disarmament when the conditions, the security conditions are right.
What level did that conversation with the Russians take place at, and when did you brief them?
Well, we've talked about it on and off, but I just briefed them this morning.
The embassy?
And we also did it in Moscow.
You know, one other thing to add to that is when you asked about NATO allies, we have had and I hope it was noted in the statements by the deputy secretaries, that we've had an ongoing dialogue throughout this process over the last year with allies that is unusual for this nuclear posture review. And we briefed the North Atlantic Council at NATO as recently as yesterday on the nuclear posture review, so that there are consultations with allies in advance of any public release.
The gentleman in the third row here.
Tony Bertucca from Inside Defense. Going to the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, could you talk a little bit about the rationale for bringing that program back? How much that will cost, when that's expected to come online, and what, again, the rationale for bringing the program back?
In the security environment that's discussed in the nuclear posture review, one of the things that has been concerning is that over the last 20 years, we've seen the growth of the role of nuclear weapons and some potential adversaries' doctrine, as well as growth in capabilities and planned growth over that time period. And so what was discussed in terms of the rationale in the NPR is that the overriding purpose of our nuclear arsenal is deterrence, and to assure allies, and as I mentioned, to hedge against uncertainty, and if necessary, provide a credible response capability. Within that, we've become concerned that we need a more flexible set of capabilities in order to have tailored deterrence. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to deterrence, as you know, and we're not deterring a single person or in a single circumstance. And so therefore, a more flexible set of capabilities that is survivable, that is credible, and can be tailored to the circumstances to maintain deterrence is the rationale behind looking at that capability. Now, as mentioned, there are two supplementary capabilities that the NPR discusses. One we've already discussed, the submarine-launched ballistic missile. You're talking about the submarine-launched cruise missile. In that regard, what the NPR talks about is that we will begin a study of the appropriate way to pursue that and the specifics around a program in that area. And so at this time, I can't quote you a specific time frame and dollar figure because of the stage of that activity. But it's one of the supplementary capabilities that we think is very important to pursue, both due to the survivability of submarine-launched cruise missiles, the flexibility that that type of platform provides. And again, here, this would involve use of low-yield nuclear weapons. Low-yield nuclear weapons have been in the U.S. arsenal for decades. The difference here would be, and as you pointed out, we formerly, in the United States, had the capability to fire cruise missiles from submarines armed with nuclear weapons. This would be to look at that capability again.
Thanks. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. So the question of what constitutes extreme circumstances is, I think, what has some folks hung up, especially in the context of cyber-physical attack on U.S. infrastructure. The National Academies has published a study on the possible effects of a cyber-physical attack on U.S. infrastructure, and the worst-case scenario that they've come up with is a service disruption possibly lasting weeks. So the question is that sort of eventuality, a limited service disruption possibly lasting weeks, is that the sort of extreme circumstance that might possibly provoke a nuclear response? And if not, if you're working with a different worst-case scenario for a cyber-physical attack on U.S. infrastructure, potentially much greater than that, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Starting at the top, the declaratory policy of the United States that we would consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances, the language on that you will find in this nuclear posture review is identical to what you will have found, that the United States would employ nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States, allies, and partners. Those words that I just spoke are the same as that appeared in the 2010 nuclear posture review released by President Obama's administration. So in that sense, there is no difference in the declaratory policy with respect to what constitutes extreme circumstances and the provision of other things. Again, I think the context in which that occurs is important. And hypothetical examples of a cyber attack or biological weapons attack, I think what's very important is there's no automaticity in this policy as to how the United States would respond. We would consider the circumstances under which that occurred. We would consider the context around that and the effects on the United States and our allies before determining what the appropriate response would be, whether that involved nuclear weapons or purely non-nuclear weapons. And so the difficulty with answering hypothetical questions is it's very hard to know what the circumstances surrounding that would be. For example, in the hypotheticals you cited, would that also involve the employment of biological weapons against the U.S. population or allies? Would it involve the use of chemical weapons against our people? Would it involve a conventional attack in other parts of the world? The context in which an attack occurred on the United States or our allies would be how we would evaluate the appropriate response. But I want to make one additional point that I forgot. I think it's very important, implied in your question, to address one thing. There is no lowering of the nuclear threshold in this nuclear posture review. That threshold remains at an incredibly high level. There has been no diminution to that. And this document is explicit in stating there is nothing in this approach that will lower the nuclear threshold. Indeed, the capabilities and the type of approach that we're pursuing is intended to raise the nuclear threshold by making the type of punishment that we could employ against an attack on the United States so high that it would not be countenanced by an adversary.
Jeff Show.
Thank you. On that theme, you had mentioned the Russian dogma of escalate to de-escalate. They seem to feel that they can escape a nuclear retaliation if they use low-yield nuclear weapons. I just want to make clear, is U.S. policy that if the United States or one of its allies is attacked by a nuclear weapon, regardless of the yield, there will be a nuclear response?
The U.S. nuclear doctrine has never involved automaticity in terms of response, and there is no automaticity in this current document. Our declaratory policy would be that we would consider the use of nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances. Obviously, one of the circumstances under which you would consider that would be a nuclear attack against the United States, of whatever yield that might be.
Well, I'm speaking about against a NATO ally. If Russia exploded a low-yield nuclear weapon against a NATO ally, would that guarantee a nuclear response from the United States?
There's no automaticity in this approach, whether a nuclear use or non-nuclear use against the United States or our allies. Now, obviously, I would highly discourage any nation from considering such an attack on the United States or our allies. That would not be in your interest to do so, to state the obvious. But with respect to the declaratory policy, it is not an automaticity in terms of response. There is always a consideration about the context in which an attack occurred and the impact on either the United States or our allies. And we have these discussions as well at NATO. And we take very seriously our Article 5 commitments and commitment to NATO, which is a nuclear alliance with capabilities also provided not by the United States but by our other allies. So certainly this would be something that would meet the criteria of an extreme circumstance in which you would consider your response.
Paul Sony from Wall Street
Washington Post.
I'm sorry. Oh, you didn't move so much.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask if we've heard an increase in what some would call nuclear saber rattling and rhetoric coming from the president in recent months, with mentions of threatening fire and fury like the world has never seen towards North Korea, and mentions of a big red button. And I'm wondering if you have any concerns that that kind of rhetoric is reducing support for the triad among the American population, that at some point Americans might think we don't want to spend $1.2 trillion or $1 trillion, or however you calculate it, on weapons that can be used by a single person's choice alone.
Maintaining a safe, credible, and effective nuclear deterrent is something that's been a bipartisan activity for many decades in this country since the dawn of the nuclear age, and I think that support continues. Bear in mind that in that chart that we're showing there, a number of the programs to recapitalize the nuclear triad were begun during the previous administration. And so in that sense, you've seen a bipartisan effort to recapitalize that nuclear triad. Funding has been requested in past years and appropriated and authorized by the Congress of the United States in that regard. And so I think the basic point that there is support amongst the elected representatives of the American people in both parties for the role of nuclear weapons and for the nuclear triad, I think, is present. Certainly, the other factor that I think affects public opinion is the world has become a more dangerous place. And certainly, our people are very concerned about what they hear emanating from North Korea, about the growth and the capabilities that regime possesses. I think all of us are concerned about some of the changes in the Russian approach to nuclear weapons, the growth of capabilities in China, the potential for other countries to acquire nuclear weapons. So I think there's been a growth amongst not only the American public, but certainly allied publics about what do those security changes mean for us, and the priority that must be placed on our nuclear enterprise to deter the most catastrophic potential attacks against the United States and our allies. And so I think that kind of support will continue going forward. And while we're going to work very hard to reduce the threats facing the United States and our allies through efforts like non-proliferation and arms control, these are still very substantial threats that we're going to face, and we need a robust, credible nuclear capability in order to deter those threats and to assure our allies.
So you have no concerns about the president's rhetoric?
As I mentioned, I think in that security environment, in dealing with that sort of threat that's grown to the United States, there is, I think, a bipartisan support for the nuclear triad and maintaining credible, robust capabilities.
Aaron Mehta from Defense News.
Thanks. John, because you mentioned that the SLBM is going to be in the 19 budget request, I wanted to know how much of what's being discussed here is being pushed forward in the 19 budget versus 20 budget. And I asked that because Secretary Shanahan said specifically a couple of months ago to us, 19 is going to have a few things, but all these reviews are going to really come out in the 2020 budget just because of the timing. So how much for DOD, how much for state, and then specifically I'd like to hear about DOE, because we've heard for years about the backlog of infrastructure, some of the challenges there, and it's become pretty clear that's not something that can wait all that much longer before it becomes catastrophic. So I'd like to hear about that.
Certainly in the FY19 budget request, the things that you see on the chart behind you for the recapitalization of the triad, those are programs of record. You should expect to see those programs again have a request behind them from the President to the Congress to fund them. I mentioned that the Sea Launched Ballistic Missile and that supplementary capability that you'll see also in there. And the reality is that all of our activities at the Defense Department, including what we're doing right now, in some way track to a budget request to the Congress. And so our new budget will be coming out shortly. Plan releases later this month, and so the specifics will be there. But this nuclear posture review will be reflected in the budget request to the Congress in terms of the capabilities that we need and the standard explanations that would accompany those will be provided.
For the administrator, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, the FY19 budget, as you know, is not released yet by the President. But talk a little bit about our process that happens after the NPR, and now that the NPR is out. The basic process, the interagency created the NPR. Now the interagency meets through the Nuclear Weapons Council to define the requirements, and then we have the standard process for in each of our organizations for creating the plans, the implementation plans. On the DoD side, the military characteristics are defined, and on our side, all the technical characteristics are defined. Those are agreed upon through the Nuclear Weapons Council, and then the resource loading of that occurs through the normal budgetary process. So, given the timing as expected, you would see probably more of the fidelity of those plans take place over this year, and probably more fidelity in the budget request in the following year, FY20.
Zach Biggs from Newsweek.
Thanks. One of the major shifts from the last NPR seems to be this emphasis on flexibility, low yield, nuclear weapons, et cetera. Do you believe that having those low yield weapons, which by definition have lesser consequences for their use, increases the likelihood that nuclear weapons might be used in a conflict? In particular, I want to point to the cruise missiles, nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Former Secretary of Defense Perry has warned about nuclear-tipped cruise missiles increasing the likelihood of a nuclear war because of confusion that might occur about whether a cruise missile is nuclear or not. So do you think that these weapons, both the low yield and the cruise missile, increase the odds of a nuclear conflict?
Short answer to your question is no. The longer answer would be that in this NPR you'll see that there is a discussion of maintaining deterrence and this concept that one size fits all does not work for deterrence. These are very different countries, say North Korea versus the concerns we have about Russia or China. These are different countries, there are different circumstances, and that we need a more flexible set of capabilities in order to have tailored deterrence. And I think you've correctly picked up on one area of emphasis in this NPR, which is greater than the past, which is a greater focus on tailored deterrence, tailoring our effects, tailoring our approach to the particular circumstances in which we face with a given adversary. The context is very important, again, in which you're trying to effect deterrence in that specific circumstance. And so therefore, some of the flexibility, the attributes of a submarine-launched ballistic missile and a submarine-launched cruise missile, survivability, difficulty of detection, the flexibility and the range of circumstances that you have to employ such a capability, where you place it, how you fly it, when you fly it, the fact that you can have some flexibility in terms of whether you signal its presence or you don't, flexibility in basing options, given that most of the world's surface is water. All of these things help provide flexible options for tailored deterrence. In terms of the nuclear threshold, as I mentioned earlier, there is no lowering of the nuclear threshold. In fact, this approach is intended to raise the nuclear threshold and keep it at a very high level.
The use of lower yield or the development of lower yield weapons, how does that increase deterrence when a larger weapon could be even more devastating to an enemy? How does the lower yield help?
When we look at some of the activities, statements, capabilities that adversaries or potential adversaries have pursued, one of the things that we want to make sure that we maintain is a flexible set of capabilities so that they not come to the mistaken impression that there would be some ranges of situations where they might employ nuclear weapons, whether they be low yield or so-called battlefield nuclear weapons, things of that nature, in a way that we would feel that we did not have credible response options in order to preserve deterrence. As mentioned earlier, the United States has had low-yield nuclear weapons in our arsenal for decades. This would not be a new addition or a new type, and it does not involve production of new nuclear weapons. So certainly I think we're not proposing an increase in the size of the U.S. nuclear stockpile. Again, the purpose of these activities is a flexible set of capabilities to provide tailored deterrence.
Ryan Brown from CNN.
Thank you. Just two quick ones. First, on North Korea, the last one was in 2010. Obviously, North Korea has made a lot of strides in its nuclear program, and you list 11 fielded or in development nuclear delivery systems from North Korea. What in this review is kind of specifically tailored to North Korea or focused on the North Korean threat? And I know you mentioned briefing Russia on this. Was China also briefed on this review?
With respect to North Korea, the capabilities in the nuclear triad that exist today, as well as the recapitalization that's discussed in the report and some of these supplementary capabilities, all of those things in various circumstances would have applicability in the type of hypothetical scenarios that we worry about with North Korea. Unfortunately, some of our concerns that we used to have a few years ago have become, quite frankly, not so hypothetical anymore in terms of the threat that we face.